When the nameless original dragon split into Reshiram and Zekrom, the remains were purported to have formed Kyurem. And when Kyurem combined itself with Reshiram, it became Kyurem-White. This absolute zero terror appeared in Pokemon Black 2, as well as the Keldeo and Hoopa movies, and was thoroughly fierce. You'd think by Gen 5 we'd no longer be impressed by big dragons, but Kyurem-White's regally imposing design leaves you no other choice. Today we're going to see if Kyurem-White was up to the task that so many other legendaries have failed at, which is taking its cool design into the competitive scene and finding success there. And so, we ask, how good was Kyurem-White actually? But before we start, we sure love getting sponsored by products that we were already using, because once again, this video is sponsored by Surfshark VPN. Surfshark is a virtual private network app and browser extension that allows you to place your computer or phone virtually in any country as if you're actually there. Surfshark has over 3,200 plus servers in 65 countries. And of course, being a VPN, Surfshark is able to mask your IP so that your data is encrypted and your privacy is secured whenever you're online. And it's the new year, and that means new content on all your favorite streaming services. You already know I love using my VPN to get the most out of my Netflix subscription, and with a VPN like Surfshark, that means you aren't getting region locked anywhere. Just hit this button and boom, watch even more content by placing yourself in whatever country you want. And you can use one account on multiple devices. I personally have Surfshark on my phone, my tablet, and both of my PCs. So if you want a sick VPN and also support the channel to help us produce more content, you can click the link in the description below or use my promo code FALLSWIPE to get Surfshark VPN for 83% off and 3 extra months for free. And in this video, we'll be going over these competitive formats. By the time Black and White 2 came around, everyone thought they had been desensitized to the excessively over-the-top level of power that had been Generation 5's calling card. However, one should never doubt Game Freak's ability to top themselves, and in classic fashion, they created a monster everyone went bug-eyed over. Kyurem-White didn't just possess a special attacking stat so over-the-top and absurd as to border on the cosmically unfathomable. It did so while packing a 140 base power Draco Meteor, which is 210 base power after stab, resisted only by steel types at the time. And that wasn't all, as it also packed a second stab Ice Beam, renowned for its amazing coverage against the Uber tier for its ability to super effectively crush popular walls in Groudon, Giratina, Gliscor, Lugia, Latias, Arceus Ground, and Arceus Grass, while also hitting most of the rest of the tier for neutral damage, such as most common Arceus forms Palkia, Dialga, and Ferrothorn. And with strong Ice Stab, neutral damage was all it needed. Ice Stab was such a powerful weapon that it gave the otherwise terrible Arceus Ice a legitimate niche, but Arceus Ice wished its icicle-plated boosted judgments could come anywhere near the deathly chill of Kyurem-White's Specs Ice Beam, and also wished it had a secondary stab like Draco Meteor, which would destroy one of the tier's most popular ice threats, Kyogre. Oh, and there's so much more. You might have noticed that steels resist both dragon and ice, while in practical terms, specially defensive steels resist both dragon and ice. Genesect can be cleanly KO'd from full HP by Draco Meteor and takes an enormous chunk from Ice Beam. For that matter, offensive Excadrill doesn't resist Ice Beam, but it also can be one-hit KO'd by Draco Meteor. Anyway, sending even a specially defensive steel into Kyurem-White was a proposition which carried with it the risk of death, because it packed a powerful fusion flare that dealt enormous, potentially lethal damage to the likes of Arceus Steel and specially defensive Jirachi. In Sandstorm, or before weather had been set up, that is, if Groudon's Sun was active, Jirachi was completely obliterated. But wait, you think, Heatran is famously specially tanky, and it resists Dragon, quad resists Ice, and is immune to Fire. Well, the former two are correct, but Kyurem-White's Turbo Blaze ability completely ignored Heatran's Flash Fire, and a Sun boosted Fusion Flare 2-hit KO'd it with ease. Plus, whichever move Kyurem-White picked for its 4th slot, it'd be one that thoroughly destroyed Heatran, whether it was the Focus Blast that smashed through even Choppleberry Tyranitar, Arceus Rock and Sand, and put immense pressure even on Chansey, or the Earth Power that allowed it to smash specially defensive Jirachi even under Rain. Both moves also crushed Arceus Steel under Rain. Finally, it wasn't just enough for Kyurem-White to be ludicrously strong and have all the type coverage it could want, it also had an excellent base 95 speed tier, which notably put it above the slew of base 90s that defined much of what was considered quote-unquote fast fast in Ubers, like Groudon, Kyogre, Dialga, Ho-Oh, and Giratina Origin. Everyone was terrified of Kyurem-White at the start of Black and White too. But as terrifying as Kyurem-White was, it had its flaws. Flaws which were significant enough to hold it back from completely wrecking the entire tier. Offensively, it was basically perfect, and you weren't going to wall it, but defensively, it was quite poor. Pretty much its best defensive quality was that it was a dragon that wasn't weak to ice, which was a great trait to have, especially since its solid natural bulk let it help play around Kyogre. However, this was also largely overshadowed by its many weaknesses. Stealth Rock was the most immediate, somewhat neutering its bulk and generally limiting its switching opportunities, and this rock weakness also extended to moves like Stone Edge from Kabutops and Arceus Ground, as well as Arceus Rock's Judgment. Kyurem-White also bore significant weaknesses to Steel, Fighting, and Dragon, and with such moves from faster Pokemon scattered everywhere, it wasn't just easy to force Kyurem-White out, it was also fairly easy to prevent it from coming in, especially with the incredibly fast pace that the offensive teams played at. Offensive teams that love stacking spikes on top of Stealth Rock and cutting into Kyurem-White's longevity even more. Still, though it was more limited against such teams, Kyurem-White still found use against them. It could generally find one opportunity to switch in per game, and that opportunity would be rewarded with the KO. After all, if defensive Pokemon couldn't withstand Kyurem-White's hits, offensive pokes didn't stand a chance. Said opportunity was generally found against a choice-locked ice, electric, or water move, which were also quite common. Plus, hyper-offensive teams were far from the only thing in the meta. Balance was also incredibly common and effective, and Kyurem-White blasted these to smithereens. Such teams often relied on Pokemon like Regenerator Ho-Oh, especially defensive Kyogre to check it. You know, those Pokemon which take obscene damage from Draco Meteor. Still, when you consider how pretty much everything else drops, the prospect of only taking immense damage becomes pretty good by comparison. That was the threshold for balanced teams check to Kyurem-White. Does it immediately get destroyed? No? Then it will do, because there aren't exactly better alternatives running around. Kyurem-White was always solid, but really came into its own on a style of offensive teams known as Magic Sun, which utilized incredibly aggressive play alongside Magic Bounce Espeon to deny hazards completely, with other tactics like Dark Void, Dark Ride to help further. Alongside Ho-Oh, Kyurem-White was one of the best beneficiaries of such a strategy being pulled off successfully, as it was far more able to unleash its absurd attacks. Though it could be little difficult to get the most mileage out of Kyurem-White's obscene power, it was well worth the effort and carved out a distinct, unique, valuable niche for itself in Black and White 2 Ubers. Generation 6's changes seemed tailor-made to irritate Kyurem-White. Yeah, it appreciated the fog buff as it was now easier to remove hazards for it, but it certainly didn't enjoy the newly added fairy types, which were completely immune to its mighty Draco Meteor. And with the addition of a fairy type, Kyurem had also gained a new weakness. This was especially notable in the new Uber tier, where Geomancy Xerneas lurked around every corner, ready to sweep at the drop of a hat. Speaking of the mighty meteor, it also had its base power nerfed, going from 140 to 130. Its other ferocious stab was a tad defanged as well, with Ice Beam going from 95 to 90 base power. Obviously, Kyurem-White still hit like a truck, but the difference, though small, was noticeable, most notably in its Draco Meteor against Kyogre, Ho-Oh, and Arceus forms. However, Kyurem-White was still a notable threat, as Ice Beam was still an excellent, powerful stab that cut through most of the tier. The Dragon Immune Xerneas didn't want to come near it, for example, while Arceus Fairy wasn't too jazzed about the prospect either. The other fairy type that wasn't afraid of Ice Beam was the Clef Key being spammed to hold the tier together against Xerneas, but Clef Key was, of course, roasted by Fusion Flare. Kyurem-White held a solid niche in X and Y Ubers for slicing through the many balanced teams popular in the tier. It reveled in the addition of Yveltal, another popular defensive Pokemon completely obliterated by its Ice Beam. Sadly, Kyurem-White's time in Gen 6 Ubers more or less came to an end with the release of Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. It still technically had a niche in the tier, but nobody was using it in games that mattered anymore. With the addition of the monstrous Primals and Mega Salamence, the pace of the games in the tier skyrocketed, and Kyurem-White couldn't keep up against the overall onslaught of hyper offense around every corner. While it wasn't the worst thing you could use, you could also do a lot better. It was thoroughly mediocre. Yeah, it dished out ludicrous damage, which is great, but it also had awful, easily exploitable defensive typing and not nearly enough speed to make up for it. Contrast this against the slew of Pokemon in the tier, which were of similar strength, had far better typing, and were either faster or could make themselves faster, or both. It wasn't just worth all the hoops you had to jump through, and Kyurem-White was forgotten. Every form of Kyurem wasn't seen in Gen 5 VGC due to all of them being restricted Pokemon. It wasn't until VGC 2016 where restricted Pokemon were allowed again. But with VGC 2016 also allowing monstrous restricted Pokemon like Primals, Xerneas, and of course, the best Pokemon in the game, Mega Rayquaza, it's no surprise there wasn't much room for something with as many significant flaws as Kyurem-White. On the few occasions it was used, it most commonly ran a Choice Scarf set, which was a solid approach as it wasn't exactly wanting for power, but loved the opportunity to get the jump on faster Pokemon that otherwise beat it one-on-one like Mega Salamence. It was still incredibly niche of course, but it did have a few placements. Tim Walsh reached 6th place with it at the Melbourne Regionals, Nihil Noor reached 5th place with it at the Adelaide Regionals, Matthias Roa reached 3rd place with it at the Chile Nationals, and Joseph Pokorny reached 25th with it at the US Nationals. Props to them for seeing the value of and succeeding with such a Pokemon. Early in Sun and Moon, Kyurem-White was occasionally used on Sticky Web offense. Opposing Pokemon having their speed dropped helped make it much more of a threat, allowing it to brandish those monstrous Specs Ice Beams so a teammate like Scarf Lunala or Extreme Killer Arceus could clean up later on. It was quite decent, if a bit specific, but was especially dangerous as once again, the tier had adopted a brand new defensive presence that Ice Beam shattered. In this case, Zygarde complete. Kyurem-White wasn't an essential Sticky Web staple, but it certainly was a solid choice for such teams. But then Ultra Sun and Moon came around, and with the addition of Necrozma Duskmane, Kyurem-White was completely shoved to the side. Not only did Duskmane withstand its stabs well, its Prism Armor ability allowed it to take even the super effective hits Kyurem-White might throw at it. And if that wasn't bad enough, it was yet another Pokemon whose greater defensive consistency allowed it to be just as threatening as Kyurem-White, as well as a much better Pokemon overall. Once again, the question was why use Kyurem-White's wall-breaking powers when you could use similarly efficacious Pokemon with better typing and speed? Especially in the case of Duskmane, who could turn into Ultra Necrozma, Kyurem-White was forgotten and spent the rest of Gen 7 Ubers in obscurity. In VGC 2019, the restricted Pokemon returned. While Kyurem-White was still generally overshadowed, it still found a small niche and occasional usage. Early on, it no longer opted for Choice Scarf as much, instead choosing to tear through the opponent with maximum flexibility and power. With Kyurem-White being an Ice type, it was a good matchup versus Groudon due to its stab Ice attacks, as well as a good teammate with Groudon because the Sun powered up its Fusion Flare. During the Sun series and the Moon series, it had a decent amount of placements at some events thanks to these players on screen. Giovanni's Kyurem actually ran Dragonium Z to one-shot big threats like bulky Groudon, Incineroar, and Kyogre. However, it struggled to overcome Venusaur and its Sleep Powder and Tapu Fini and Tapu Lele. But unfortunately, in the Ultra series, with the Primals being allowed and Groudon no longer being weak to Ice, Kyurem-White completely fell off, having no notable placements during this time. But still, it did have its role in the Sun and Moon series. And thank you to Giovanni Polanco for the information. Kyurem-White was quite good in the early iterations of Gen 8 Ubers, those being the Home and Isle of Armor metagames. The restricted Pokedex and addition of heavy-duty boots to bypass its eternal enemy Stealth Rock did wonders for it. Of course, it didn't need to run boots and could be a terror with Specs or Life Orb, reveling in the lower power level of the tier, putting much less pressure on it, thus giving it an easier time breaking past Necrozma Duskmane. Kyurem-White absolutely shredded the other defensive Pokemon that were everywhere, as Tangrowth, Quagsire, Corviknight, and even the mighty Toxapex were utterly mauled by Freeze Dry. And since these were used to stave off Zacian Crowned in some form, Kyurem-White became one of the Sword Wolf's best partners, using Zacian C's checks as an entry point to unleash its terrifying attacks. It was a legitimate piece of the tier, until once again, the metagame expanded and developed in the Crown Tundra. Dynamax was banned, Zacian Crowned was banned, and Zacian itself was banned. This led to a metagame Kyurem-White could prey on much less easily, with the likes of Boots Ho-Oh trekking it with great reliability and the new offensive teams popping up featuring monsters like Calyrex Shadow, Meteor Beam Eternatus, and Marshadow, having no problem bowling it over. If one wanted Ice-type offense, they were better off going with the triumvirate of physical options, like Weavile, Galarian Darmanitan, and of course, Kyurem-Black. Even the generally outclassed Calyrex Ice would be a better option. And so Kyurem-White once again dropped out of viability and usage in Gen 8 Ubers. Kyurem-White left even less of a mark than usual in VGC 2021. Adrian Hurley reached 8th place with it at the second Winter Circuit VR qualifiers, while Matteo Agostini and Manuel Barrea reached 6th and 12th respectively at the same Winter Circuit's grand finals. However, it was generally overlooked in a metagame full of Zacian Crown and Sun Spam. In 2022 though, Kyurem-White really picked up steam and left a genuine impact on the metagame for the first time in its VGC career. This was most notably seen in Huang Yang GA's early usage of it, which allowed them to place second at the Taipei Regionals in early January. They used an Assault Vest Kyurem-White, letting it shrug off a plethora of special attacks while maintaining a vicious attack on defensive course, with Freeze Dry slashing through common bulky Pokemon often seen together like Kyogre, Rotom Wash, Landorus T, Seismitoad, Gastrodon, and Zapdos, while Fusion Flare made quick work of their favorite partner, Ferrothorn. With physical defense investment and Intimidate support, Kyurem-White could even withstand a Behemoth Blade from Zacian Crown, and if it Dynamax, Max Quake would take Zacian Crown out. Inspired by Huang's original approach and success, many other players began using Kyurem-White and achieved a large deal of success with it cumulatively. Other Kyurem users decided to use Life Orb over Assault Vest for extra damage, and there are a lot of placements for Kyurem-White during this time, so for brevity, we've limited the placements to above top 25 except for Nationals and Worlds. Congratulations to these players on screen, especially to Nathan Ortiz, and I'm so sorry if I butcher your name, Visita Vasudevan, as both of these players top cut 2 events with Kyurem-White, each with a placement in top 8 respectively. Unfortunately, Kyurem-White did not make much of an impact at Worlds, with its only placements in Masters being Ben Grismer and Nathan Ortiz at 55th and 85th place respectively. Congrats to Onk IR in the junior division for getting 7th place at Worlds though. So all in all, Kyurem-White had a great run even in a meta where Zacian Crown is legal, and we consider that absolutely a win despite its drop off at the final event. And that's it. So how good was Kyurem-White actually? Well, even by Uber standards, it is monstrously powerful, not just because of its inordinate special attack stat, but because of the powerful stabs with great coverage it wields, as well as its brutally strong coverage options. It's held back by its weakness-laden typing, the nerfs to its stabs, the additions of fairy types, and generally the same thing it was originally created to be, power creep. However, it had several notable niches in Ubers and VGC over the generations, though nowhere was it better and more iconic than the place it got its start, Gen 5 Ubers, where Dracometer was always the right move. Thanks for watching, everyone, and as always, if you liked the video and you want to see more, be sure to subscribe to False Swipe Gaming for more weekly Pokemon content. And in the comments, I want to know, what do you think about competitive Kyurem-White? What would you give it to make it better over other Ubers? Whatever it is, let me know in the comments. And thank you so much to our patrons for continued support of our videos, and thank you to everyone else as well. And follow my crew on these social media platforms. And that's all I got. See you next time, everyone.